In his new book, The Next Decade, George Friedman argues that where big rivals joust with each other, such as China and Japan, it would be in America's interests to step back from the jousting if US interests are not affected. But, I asked George, is it in the American character to step back and watch from the sidelines?
Well, it's like the English. They had to have their heads handed to them a few times before they learned their lessons. The United States has been a global hegemon for 20 years. It's a fairly early period of time in which to judge what the United States does. But the United States will, over the next decade, certainly learn to step back. We are going to be coming out of the Islamist wars with a much more distant perception.
What about the nuclear threat from North Korea? Surely the Americans can't step back from that.
Well, actually, the United States can step back from that. It's a problem that certainly affects the South Koreans. It deeply affects the Japanese, affects the Chinese and the Russians. There are lots of people to deal with North Korea's nuclear problem. It doesn't require the United States. Whether or not it has a deliverable nuclear device, I don't know. But there are people quite powerful, many of the nuclear powers themselves, with a greater interest in the future of North Korea than the United States. And when you say step back, it means do two things. First, re-examine all the relationships you have, including the idea that the United States is somehow uniquely responsible for the future of North Korea. And secondly, always understand that the United States should never act if there's someone else available to act who will be forced to act if the United States doesn't. One of the problems of North Korea is that the United States has been acting. And therefore the Chinese, the Russians, the Japanese, the South Koreans are manipulating the United States in various ways and not solving the problem. I can assure you, if the United States made it very clear that their nuclear program is not the American problem, the Chinese and the Russians would deal with it in an appropriate way.
So, summing up, what's your conclusion for the next decade?
The most important question in the next 10 years is how the United States manages its power and whether or not the United States can manage the relationship between the empire and the republic. Whether or not imperial America will overwhelm its republican institutions, whether the republican institutions undermine the empire, or whether or not they find a way to coexist. I know this is an Americentric view of the world, but it's a very Americentric world. The United States is the overwhelming economic power. It certainly has economic problems, but then Britain went through a catastrophic financial crisis in 1825. It has certainly had massive failures in its foreign policy, but not as catastrophic as the British loss of the North American colonies. So when you look at the things that Britain went through and still emerged as a very great empire, you can see that the things on that scale the United States experience isn't on that order. This is going to be the decade where the United States must mature, where it must move from being what it was at the beginning of the century, virtually a third world power on the margins of history, to what it became in 1991, the only global deep power in the world, to one with a mature political system, a mature presidency, and above all, a mature public that knows how to manage all this. And this is going to be the test, because if the United States achieves it, we're going to have a very different world in 2020, 2030. And if the United States doesn't achieve it, it'll be different still. This is the thing to be looking at in this decade.
George Friedman, whose new book, The Next Decade, is on sale now at good bookshops and online at Stratfor. I hope you've enjoyed these conversations about the next decade as much as I have. Thanks for being with us. Goodbye.